Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišák, and I work as the deputy head of the foreign desk at the Slovak daily Pravda, which by the name means truth, and is not the Russian Pravda. Michal Onderče is a full professor of international relations in the Department of Public Administration and Sociology at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and his most recent book is titled Europe's Nuclear Umbrella. The current global instability, ongoing wars, and the collapse of key arms control treaties provide a perfect, albeit grim, setup for our debate. We discuss who holds Europe's nuclear umbrella and what Europe can do about it, French nuclear plans, Russian nuclear threats, and we also fact-check nuclear claims by US President Donald Trump. And if you listen to my podcast, The Global Agora, regularly, you know that I am not shy about asking apocalyptic questions. So, could the Iran war go nuclear? Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. You can find the link in the description of this episode. And now, on to the new debate. Michal, this is what US President Donald Trump said about the Iranian nuclear program. If we didn't strike within 2 weeks, they would have had a nuclear weapon. Does this reflect reality in any way, or is it a completely made-up claim?
For the past 15 years, Iran has been a month away from getting a nuclear weapon. So Iran was something that academics call a nuclear threshold state. It was a country that had the technical capacity and it had the material that it needed for a crude nuclear device, but it didn't actually set down the path to actually produce the nuclear weapons. We know that after June 2025 strikes, Iran has done some work on actually developing warheads and some work on explosives. But as I said, Iran has been more or less in the same stage for the past 15 years. So from what I understand from open source intelligence that has been published by various authors online, there hasn't been any acceleration of the process and there hasn't been any major shift. The only shift that we had seen was that up until June 2025, there has been a sort of increase in the stockpile of enriched uranium by Iran. And that is something that one needs to be very clear about. There is no country in the world without a nuclear weapon program that had as much enriched uranium. There was no good reason for Iran to have that amount of enriched uranium. However, from what we understand from open source information, much of it was sort of buried after the strikes with access points either collapsing or bombed. So it was very difficult to see that Iran was somehow accelerating being a threat.
So it was at least partly made up claim.
The thing is that there has been, and this is something where President Trump is not necessarily away from his party. Historically, there has been this argument within the Republican Party that Iran is interested in getting nuclear weapons. And what multiple American intelligence agencies, but also what international organizations and experts said was that Iran have never made the explicit decision to actually go and build a nuclear weapon. And so in that sense, what President Trump said that Iran could get a nuclear weapon was not completely false, and because Iran could get a nuclear weapon, except that even after June 2025, we didn't have any evidence that Iran decided that it does want to get a nuclear weapon.
Can you imagine a scenario in which the Iran war would go nuclear? Of course, the US and Israel have nuclear weapons and Iran possesses nuclear material. Could something catastrophically go wrong?
I think there is a very unlikely scenario. I personally think it's extremely unlikely, far-fetched. There has been on social media suggested by some people that, for instance, if the war drags out, both the United States and Israel start to run short on missile interceptors for their missile defense, then the United States and Israel could try to somehow force a quick end to the war. And some people on social media suggested that this could be with the use of tactical nuclear weapons. I think while this is technically possible, I would find it extremely unlikely. Because what we see at the moment is that the US has been really successful in penetrating and demolishing Iranian air defense. And so, if the US were to want to increase the speed of bombardment, it would have other means to do it than with a nuclear weapon. There would be no practical need to do it with a nuclear weapon. So, in that sense, I have seen some commentary on social media. I would personally find it extremely unlikely.
One more fact check regarding Trump, if I may. In his State of the Union address, he claimed that he ended 8 wars. I'm not going to ask you about those wars, but he also said that Pakistan and India would have gone to nuclear war. Again, does anything suggest that Pakistan and India were recently actually on the verge of a nuclear war?
Of course, in case of India and Pakistan, any border skirmish that gets beyond the stage of border skirmish is often rumored to be a sort of on the verge of nuclear war. And we have to realize that India and Pakistan are in a very unusual situation because they are basically neighbors. The flight times of missiles are extremely short, and so the risks are very high. Now, having said this, I am not aware of situation that India and Pakistan were in really close situations of nuclear war. That doesn't mean that President Trump doesn't have access to classified information that hasn't been leaked to the public.
Michal, in general, how does nuclear deterrence work? Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not just about the number of nuclear weapons. It is above all about the composition of the nuclear arsenal. Am I right?
I would say that there are two elements for the theorists of nuclear deterrence that are essential to make nuclear weapon deterrence quote unquote work. On one hand, there is having the capacity to conduct nuclear strike. And that may include the numbers, but also the composition. And there is the willingness to actually use that. So you might be willing, but if you don't have capacity, that doesn't make the deterrent posture very trustworthy. If you have the capacity, but you're not willing to use them, that also doesn't make it very trustworthy. Very often, the composition might actually feed into the trustworthiness element. And that comes down to essentially whether one can make the threat actually believable to the other party. And that's a pretty high order because basically any use of nuclear weapon is likely to invite a response which is going to be extremely damaging. And therefore, it sort of invites the question, are you willing to sustain the response that might come?
We know that in the autumn of 2022, there were concerns that Russia might use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. Can we say that Russia was successfully deterred from doing so at that time? And what should be the main lesson for Europe and NATO from this dangerous episode?
As you may know, I have written a paper with two of my colleagues, Anna Clara Arndt and Livio Horowitz, where we essentially argued that this was an episode where Russia made a real threat of the use and tried to use nuclear coercion, and that it was deterred from doing that by combination of three elements. And we think that there is one, which is that Russia overstated its own claims or its own belief in how useful the nuclear threat would be. It also underestimated the stakes which the Western countries, including Europe, but also the US, had in the conflict. And the third element was that Russians misunderstood the stakes of the global South. Now, when it comes to the stakes of the US and the EU and the European countries, we by now know from the information which is in public domain that there have been multiple high-level private and public ways to outreach to Russians to make it pretty clear that things will get very bad for them if they decide to use nuclear weapon on the battlefield. At the same time, we know from public domain at the moment that there have been multiple countries from the global south, including India and China, that have made it very clear to Russian leadership that they would not approve the use of nuclear weapons, that this would not be something that would be very easy for them. And so in the piece that we wrote, we essentially understood that Russia sort of misunderstood this contextual frame. And at the same time, I mean, we have seen that Russians have tried those threats and they might try them again in the future. I'm not saying that this is a strategy which may pay off for them, but I wouldn't put it past Russia to try it again in the future.
Michal, you New book is titled Europe's Nuclear Umbrella. Who is holding this umbrella? The Americans, and does the Trump administration also want to hold it, let's say, forever?
Great question. So I think the nuclear umbrella over Europe at the moment is an American umbrella, but it's being held by the alliance. All other allies are the ones who are contributing to the umbrella. Of course, the weapons as such are American, but European allies are contributing to the deterrence mission of the alliance by providing the aircraft for the dual capable mission, by training to provide conventional support for nuclear operations, by being part of the nuclear planning group, and so on and so forth. So it's an American umbrella held by the alliance. And this is actually what makes it really persistent, because it is not a web of bilateral agreement. It's really an alliance policy, and the whole alliance is behind it. This is also what makes it so difficult for individual member states to step out of it, because there is social pressure, but there is also this institutional expectation that member states are going to work together for this goal. Will the Trump administration want to hold it forever? Now, the Trump administration has been pretty clear, and it has become even clearer in recent weeks and months, that it does expect Europe to take a greater responsibility and greater role in conventional deterrence in Europe. And it wants European countries to take on greater conventional responsibility in Europe. At the same time, and I think this is important to underscore, President Trump, Secretary Hexet, all other representatives have time and again said that the US does not weaken its nuclear deterrent over Europe. From what we understand from recent statements of the US officials, also the US is in a process of sort of reorientation towards Asia Pacific and towards a hemispheric defense. And I mean, at least the turning towards Asia Pacific is something that we have seen already under Trump's first administration and under Biden. But there is also no desire to immediately withdraw all the troops or all the weapons from Europe. So in that sense, we see at least some continuation of the commitment to Europe. I think the last element which we need to take into consideration is that American officials, even in the Trump administration, most likely realize very well that a sort of very rapid withdrawal from Europe or questioning of the nuclear umbrella would lead towards, or at least would push some Europeans towards thinking about proliferation. And this is not something that the US is interested in.
France is one of only two nuclear powers in Europe, and unlike the UK, operates a nuclear weapons system that is entirely independent of the United States. French President Emmanuel Macron recently said, and I will quote him, "We must strengthen our nuclear deterrent in the face of the combination of threats, and we must consider our deterrent strategy within the depths of the European continent." So could the American nuclear umbrella in Europe be at least partly replaced by French one, or could the two be combined?
It's a great question. I was recently a member of an expert group organized by Munich Security Conference that put out a report called Mind the Deterrence Gap, where we are looking at 5 possible future scenarios for nuclear deterrence in Europe. And one of the 5 that we are looking into is also a strengthening of the role of French and British nuclear deterrent in Europe. France has, of course, had a long-term ambition to play a leading role in European security. And French presidents have repeatedly said that the French national nuclear deterrent has a European dimension. President Macron has repeatedly also talked about the role for the French nuclear deterrent in European security and has hinted at the willingness to provide it. The greatest challenge for the French national nuclear deterrent, and this is where we come back to the question that we had at the beginning about the sources of nuclear deterrence, is both the desire but also the structure of the arsenal. President Macron may have said that he considers Europe as such to be of importance for French national security, but he needs to make it also trustworthy to the allies or to the other party. In other words, he needs to make it clear that he actually means what he says. And for that to be true, the structure of the French nuclear arsenal would need to develop further. The French nuclear arsenal would need to get capabilities which are able to provide for more steps on the escalation ladder. So it would mean developing some sort of a tactical nuclear weapon. And it would need to develop capabilities to either throw, to thwart, so limit any nuclear counterstrike, or to preempt it. And France at the moment doesn't have those capabilities. France's nuclear strategy up until now has been built around the idea of strict sufficiency. And that sort of makes sense if your idea is nuclear weapons are the ultimate weapon that could be used to only inflict unacceptable costs on the counterpart. If that's your idea, then the French arsenal makes sense. But of course, if you sit in, let's say, in Warsaw or in Vilnius, then your question is going to be, would France really be willing to bring about the end of the world for Warsaw? And that question is not necessarily answered yes. And so for that reason, France needs to make it clear that it is serious about deterring attacks on these countries, if it is serious about deterring the attacks on these countries, while being able to bear the costs.
So do you think that France will do this?
Now, that of course requires financial investment, which is not easy for France. It would require technological change, which cannot be done over time. And to a great degree, that requires strategic adjustment, which is not something that is easy to do. So even if the French leadership is serious about the role of France, it probably is not yet ready to go the whole 9 yards to be able to provide this. And so, to their credit, the statements that we hear from the French officials, I think they are increasingly realizing that they need to do something more to assure European allies. But I also think that they will very soon start to realize that they don't want to or they cannot provide the American style of nuclear umbrella and deterrence.
But do you think that Europeans should encourage France to do more?
I think at this moment, what we see is that for most of the allies, French umbrella is not seen as a replacement of the American one, but it's seen as a sort of an additional insurance. And that means that they might be willing to be more involved and in many ways pull France into European orbit. But they are also not going to put as huge burden on France because they don't expect France to be the only one to carry it going forward. I think one of the things that is really interesting about the statement of President Macron is that he also talked about, for instance, things like joint trainings, exercises, participation of allies in French nuclear exercises, and so on and so forth. This is something that hasn't been done up until now. And if allies do end up participating in French exercises, if allies do get a conventional support role, if French elements of nuclear deterrent, and that doesn't mean nuclear weapons, but sort of any support elements get deployed to the territory of the allies, that means that allies will pull France into European orbit. And I think that is something that would be a good step towards making the French addition to Europe's nuclear umbrella more trustworthy.
Just theoretically, imagine that France will do all the things you said. There will be financial commitment, there will be technological commitment, there will be also some kind of broader understanding on the European level that we need it. And let's do it around French nuclear arsenal. How would you think that Americans would react to this? Would they see it as something beneficial to them or as something that might be, the threat is not a good word, but they might see it as a competition?
It's a good question. US officials have been quite outspoken that they do not want any allied proliferation. So they do not want any new nuclear weapons in Europe. They have been also quite critical, especially former officials from the Biden era in various blocs have been quite critical about the shortcomings of the French nuclear program and its ability to deter various threats. I think their view still is that France, at the end of the day, will not be either able to do these steps, or France will not be capable of paying for them. So in that sense, I don't think there is any thinking in the US at the moment about what if this were to happen. I think if it were to happen, as long as European allies don't try to replace their American relationship through this, the US would not necessarily be fundamentally opposed.
You mentioned your report that was published at the Munich Security Conference, Mind the Deterrence Gap. assessing Europe's nuclear options. And the report assesses 5 policy options currently discussed in the European defense and security cycle regarding nuclear deterrence. And one of the options mentioned in your report is the pursuit of new independent national nuclear deterrence. Perhaps this is slightly a naive question, but how complicated is it to build a nuclear pump? Would most European countries be able to do it if they would like to? Even Slovakia, for example?
Well, I don't think Slovakia would be able to. Well, I mean, so I think there are two elements to it. The first one is the technology is out there. We know more or less how the technology works. The second thing is, of course, developing a nuclear arsenal takes enormous amount of financial resources, technological expertise, and commitment. But as I often say to my students, if North Korea can make it, some of the richest and most technologically advanced countries in the world would be able to make it. And this is no disrespect to North Korea. European countries are much more developed technologically, they're much more developed militarily, they're much wealthier. So they would be able to do it if they really wanted. I think European countries don't want at the moment. And I think at the end of the day, the financial cost and the potential for political opprobrium would be so prohibitive that most of the European countries would, at the end of the day, not necessarily want to go down that route. That doesn't mean that there isn't a handful of candidates whom, in my wildest dreams, I could imagine going down that route. But this is not really a strategy that I would predict for a country like Slovakia.
Tell me something about your wildest dreams, please.
So very often we hear, for instance, about Germany in various media outlets. Every now and then there's also reports in newspapers. There are opinion pieces that are being published where people sort of put forward ideas about a German bomb. And obviously, it would be something that would be totally contrary to German strategic culture, to its positioning. It would be very complicated for various reasons, but it doesn't mean Germany wouldn't be able to do it. It wouldn't be welcomed by the superpowers. It wouldn't be welcomed by the US. It wouldn't be surely not welcomed by the Russians, but it doesn't mean that Germany wouldn't be able to do it. It's just, as we outlined also in the report, there are so many minuses and it will be so costly that we don't think this is really the right option for European countries. Every now and then one hears, for instance, there are sometimes experts in Poland who suggest that Poland might want to think about its own nuclear deterrent. Again, we sort of discussed that. Again, extremely costly, difficult, not impossible, but really out there in the category of wildest dreams.
But what if Russia is successful in Ukraine, if Russia will win this war, then I can imagine that Poland can accelerate, maybe not their own weapons program, but definitely asking Americans, okay, bring something here.
Yeah, but that would actually fall under our scenario number one, where we talk about doubling down on American deterrent, which could translate into various European countries being interested in joining NATO's nuclear sharing mission. And that could be done either by stationing American nuclear weapons in other and new European countries. For the record, all we know, there is no such discussion at the moment ongoing. And there is also, there is currently ambition by the United Kingdom to purchase dual capable aircraft. And there have been some updates made in an airbase in Lakenheath, but there is no discussion in continental Europe. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it could also mean that these European countries would get their aircraft certified for the nuclear mission, but no bombs would be actually deployed in these countries. So they would be somehow in other way involved in case of contingency. So that would actually fall into our first scenario. And in the report, we talk about the first scenario as the one which is most straightforward. So in many ways, this might be the easiest way for European allies to tie the US back to Europe.
And Michal, to wrap up, this is my favorite question for everybody who is dealing with nuclear weapons. Are nuclear weapons peacemakers humanity needs or tools of the apocalypse and we should get rid of them?
I think if you had a green field and you would be building a new system of world security, you wouldn't build it around nuclear weapons. However, now that we have them, And now that they exist, I think the responsibility is to manage them in a way that prevents any catastrophic outcomes. Because I don't think there is any doubt that the use of nuclear weapons would be catastrophic. I don't know anyone, maybe with the exception of a very small group of people, who wouldn't think that this would be something really catastrophic. And so there is a responsibility to try to think about how can we decrease the risks. And that includes also disarmament, that includes arms control, that includes risk reduction, that includes also taking steps that would make the chances of the use of nuclear weapons much smaller. I'm not necessarily happy with what is happening these days in the world, but at the same time, I think that any sort of very radical proposals which say, oh, we should abolish nuclear weapons and push for disarmament if needed unilaterally, at the moment are not necessarily the right way to go ahead.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe and listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. The link is in the episode description. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.